Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture, Black Migration and the Transformation of Northern Cities in the 20th Century, to be given by Professor Leah Boustan. Professor Boustan is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of California, Los Angeles. She received her bachelor's degree from Princeton and her master's and doctoral degrees in economics from Harvard University. She's a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research associate at the California Center for Population Research. I'd like to thank the Department of Economics at Dartmouth for co-sponsoring her visit to campus this week. Professor Boustan's work focuses on the role of internal and international migration in U.S. economic history, and in particular, the impacts of large-scale migrations on the way we live today. A starting point for the strand of her work that she will discuss today is the fact that the United States is, in many respects, quite segregated. Specifically, in metropolitan areas, most blacks live in the center city and most whites live in the suburbs. This outcome is the result of two large-scale migrations over the 20th centuries. Blacks moved from the rural south to the urban north by the millions, and whites moved in even greater numbers from the cities to the suburbs. These differences matter quite a lot. Many public services are locally financed, public education being the primary one. Differences between the resources of cities and suburbs thus translate into differences in access to high-quality education. These differences in access have in turn motivated many contentious public policy interventions over the last several decades, whether in the form of integrating the schools, integrating the school funding basis, or providing federal monies to avoid forcible integration. One cannot naively connect the two migrations. People choose where to live for a variety of different reasons. For example, if a city is booming, that will lead to high demand for new suburbs by current city dwellers and also present an attractive destination for lower-income migrants. We could observe whites in the suburbs and blacks in the cities without there necessarily being a phenomenon of white flight. The task of the social scientist is to figure out what's causal, to find the experiment hidden in the non-experimental data. To do this, you have to find factors that influence why migrants would arrive in the metropolitan area that are not related to whether the city is booming. Professor Boustan's strategy for doing this, connecting black arrivals to historical patterns of migration from particular southern areas to particular northern cities, and then using changing economic and agricultural conditions in those southern areas to identify the causal effect, is one of the best examples of social science research I've encountered. Professor Boustan's scholarship is provocative in its origin, interdisciplinary in its appeal, meticulous in its methodology, and persuasive in its conclusions. I look forward to teaching it again to my students in my local public policy course this winter, and to hearing more about the economic history of the black migration and white flight this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Leah Boustan.
Well, I want to start by thanking Andrew for what was truly a really generous and kind introduction. He makes Professor Boustan sound like someone that I want to meet and learn from. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate Andrew and Liz for inviting me to Dartmouth this week. I also want to say that I think it's fitting to be talking about black migration to the north and particularly its effect on urban housing markets under the auspices of the Nelson Rockefeller Center. Because Nelson Rockefeller, when he was governor of New York, participated in the ending of, or participated, I should say, in passing legislation at the state level to end housing discrimination on the basis of race. And then when he was running for president in 1966, he advocated a federal law of that nature, which then did pass in 1968. So it's this time period that I'll be focusing on in my lecture today, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, part of which time was the tenure of Rockefeller as governor of New York. As Andrew alluded to, in the middle part of the 20th century, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, more than 4 million African Americans moved from the rural South to settle in industrial cities of the North and West. And this image here that I'm starting with, this painting from Jacob Lawrence's migration series, illustrates a cluster of such migrants in an unnamed train station, selecting between 3 of these possible destination cities: Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. And settling in cities like Chicago and New York really changed the course of history for millions of black families who, through this process, transformed from sharecroppers and agricultural laborers into factory workers and urban dwellers. The title of this talk, Competition in the Promised Land, is inspired by the fact that these black migrants themselves referred to the migration in biblical proportions. They used biblical imagery to discuss the history. So they talked about the exodus from the south, and they referred to their destinations in the north as coming to the promised land. But I also want to point your attention to the first word in the title, competition. So my focus today is not going to be on the benefits of the migration to the migrants themselves, which were considerable, but rather on the effect that these migrants had on the destinations that received them. And like other waves of migrants in US history and the wave of migration we're experiencing today, the migration did have winners and losers. Migrants did generate competition in the labor markets of the North and in the housing markets. So we're going to look at this process together, focusing today, as I said, on housing markets. Before detailing these effects, though, I want to start by emphasizing that the Great Black Migration, as this era is known, is really just one of the waves of mass migration that the US has experienced. Starting with large waves of migrants from Ireland and Germany in the 1840s, followed by the Southern and Eastern Europeans, some of whom are illustrated here on the left. This wave began in 1880 and ended in 1914. And today, the Asian and Latin American migrants entering the United States. So I'm juxtaposing these two pictures here, the one on the left of Southern and Eastern Europeans and the one on the right of Southern blacks, to illustrate some of the commonalities between these waves of migrants. You'll notice that the first wave here, the Eastern European migration, ended in 1914, and the black migration picks up in 1915. And this coincidence of timing, this overlap in timing, is not a coincidence. In fact, black migrants were moving north to take the very same jobs that previously had been held by waves of migrants from Italy, Poland, and so on. And these waves were choked off in World War I. So that's why the ending date of 1914, as the shipping lanes are disrupted by the war, and then permanently reduced by the closing of the border in 1924. So it's really the ending of this wave of migration that ushers in the black migration that we're going to be talking about today. So these waves of migrants are really quite similar, starting out with the fact that they literally are holding the same jobs. And I've illustrated a few of the other similarities here at the bottom of the slide. So for example, and most importantly perhaps, the flow of migration tended to follow work opportunities. So migrants leave low-wage, often rural economies, whether in Poland or whether in Mississippi, and move to the higher-wage industrial cities of the North. And through that process, these migrants, both the Southern and Eastern Europeans and the blacks, increase their own earnings power. In the case of European migrants, often doubling or more than doubling their income. And in the case of blacks, what we can see in the data looked like an increase of around 30 to 40% of annual income simply by this process of moving. So that's as much as I'm going to say about the benefit of the migration to the migrants. I just want this to be in your mind, though, so that we don't think at the end of the day that the migration was a bad outcome for American history, but to complicate the story and to talk about some of the consequences in cities. I've just finished telling you ways in which these waves of migrants are similar, but I also want to point out that there are ways in which these migrants are potentially quite different. And most obviously, perhaps most importantly, is the fact that black migrants are black. Black migrants are of a different race, and by virtue of this black migration, the very complexion of American cities changes. So for the first time, American cities start to encounter a sizable black residential population. And although white residents were largely insulated, actually, from competition with these black migrants in the labor market, and that's actually a subject of some other work of mine that I won't be talking about today, but is available on my website. So competition in the labor market, not so much, but white residents did compete with black newcomers for urban space. And urban space is inherently zero-sum. In any one place, in any one housing unit, only one family can be living at a point in time. So in-migration to American cities, the black in-migration strained the boundaries of existing small, early 20th century black neighborhoods, and very quickly began spilling out over these boundaries, expanding into what was traditionally, at the time, white territory. And some white households responded quite vocally, trying to defend the racial character of their turf. And I've called that here white fight. I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. And others chose to relocate, to give up on the idea of defending their neighborhood and relocate instead to the growing and predominantly white suburban ring. Now, historians have emphasized quite a bit, have placed most of their emphasis on this process of white fight, in which white residents defended their neighborhoods. And white residents used a number of tactics to keep potential black neighbors at bay. At the early point of this process, white residents actually had the legal system to rely on. Series of white neighbors entered into contracts called racially restrictive covenants, where as property owners, they would agree that the property would never be rented to or sold to a black family. And these contracts were enforced by the courts until the late 1940s. They were invalidated by the Supreme Court in '48, and at that point, white residents turned to extra-legal means of violence and intimidation, as well as potentially nonviolent protest, as I'm illustrating in this picture here. So this is just one case of white protest. We want white tenants in our white community, this sign says. And I think the reason why historians have focused so heavily on white fight is that this form of protest leaves a mark in the historical record. So if you vocally defend your position, you have a presence in the city streets that's covered by journalists, you might write op-eds to the local paper. But if instead you use your exit strategy, if you opt individually to leave your city neighborhood and move out to the suburbs, this is a pattern that may not leave a trace on an individual level, and in this case, we really need to turn to population statistics to see evidence of this. So any one person leaving the suburb might not be noticed, leaving the city for the suburbs might not be noticed, but when this happens at a large enough scale, this is something that we can pick up in quantitative historical data. So that will be the task for today. And I hope that these images have provided a brief historical context for today's talk. I think what you'll see for the rest of the talk will be primarily some graphs. That underlying these graphs are the experiences of not just hundreds of thousands, but millions of households. So my goals for the talk are these. I want to go through three exercises with you. I want to start with offering a few key facts about the Black migration. So how many Blacks left the South overall, when did they leave, and where did they settle in the North? So thinking about those 3 destination points illustrated in the Jacob Lawrence picture. Then I would like to document the typical response of white households to Black arrivals, and I'll show you through my estimates that there's a sizable white flight response, that for every 1 Black entrant into a center city, there's 2 or 2.5 white departures for the suburbs. And this period of mobility that I'll be focusing on, 40s, 50s, and 60s, gives rise to the cities that are still with us today, as Andrew said in his introduction. So where the city centers are heavily minority and the suburban ring predominantly white. So this is the backstory to the cities that have now been bequeathed to us. Now, why should we care about the fact that cities are heavily Black and suburbs are heavily white? Well, in the United States, public services are provided at the local level, at least very much so in the 40s and 50s, a bit less so today. And as a result, this form of segregation between city and suburb has real consequences for who has access to public services. Most importantly, among these, probably education. So in the final part of the talk, I want to pose a further question, which is, all right, we can see something in the data that looks like white flight, but why did whites flee for the suburbs anyways, given that at the time, whites that lived in cities lived in white enclaves. They lived in predominantly white neighborhoods even within the city. And usually we think of white flight as a response to local interactions with neighbors, a fear that a Black family might move next door. But this was really not a plausible fear, or whites may have feared this, certainly, but it wasn't, in the data, it doesn't look like this was something that was very likely to happen. So is it just an overreaction, or is there something else going on? So the hint of the answer that I have in mind, it harkens back to this point about public services. So even if you live in an all-white enclave within the city, as your city becomes more diverse racially and also in socioeconomic terms with Black immigration, the extent of city services, the distribution of services, the city taxes that are imposed, all of these will change. And by living in the city, you are receiving city services and paying city tax rates. Simply by moving to the suburbs, you're now being provided with, your services are now provided by a different local political entity. So even with an identical house, in an identical neighborhood with identical neighbors, it still might be the case that whites were encouraged to move out to the suburbs for these reasons. Before I begin even, though, with goal number 1, which were the key facts about the Black migration, I want to just start with a brief note about the methodology. And I think I've alluded to this to some extent by contrasting what I do to the pictures and images that I started out the talk with. But I want to underscore that I'm a quantitative economic historian. And by quantitative, I mean that I'm interested in the typical behavior of the population as a whole, rather than the experience of any one individual, any one idiosyncratic case. And I suspect that a number of you are quantitative economic historians as well, but you just don't know it. So what I'm thinking about here is, think about that typical New York Times Magazine article that purports to bring out a new trend. And the one that I think is most famous in the past 5 or 6 years is this magazine article about the opt-out revolution, saying that highly educated women who go to schools like Dartmouth and then continue and have a law degree or an MBA are, after all that education, instead deciding to stay home and raise their kids. That could be happening. But we start the article with an anecdote, with a book club of high-powered women in Atlanta, all of whom had met at Princeton, and all of whom had decided to stay home. And for me, when I read an article like that, I skip right to the next page to see if there's a graph or a table or some quantitative evidence that illustrates changes and trends over time. So it's not that I'm not willing to be motivated by an anecdote, but it's that I want to see whether the anecdote matches up with the larger population-wide data. So if that's also how you approach these types of articles, then you are also potentially a quantitative economic historian. So for today, I'm going to try to infer the response to black migration, not by asking white households why they moved or if they moved, but instead by observing their residential location decisions in 72 northern and western cities. That's pretty much all of the northern and western cities large enough to be captured in the data in this way, and it represents millions of white households. The data itself are from government sources. They come from the censuses of housing and population for the most part. And I do want to underscore really how very different this method is from what is typically done in the study of the black migration of cities during this period. Usually when I tell people what I'm working on, they say, oh, what city? Chicago? Detroit? And so I say, no, all of them, all 72 cities. And they say, well, how do you know about all of them? I mean, so what I'm gaining in breadth, of course, I'm sacrificing in depth. I won't have specific stories of specific institutions and governors, beyond Nelson Rockefeller at the beginning. In that way, it's quite perhaps different from what you might have been expecting when you arrived at the talk. The last thing here, though, is I also want to mention the word economic history. What do I mean by economic history? It's different from quantitative history. By this, I mean that I'm an economist, so I share many of the assumptions that other economists might hold. In particular, I believe we can learn more about the world by observing individual and household behavior rather than asking people to describe their motivations. So there are a number of studies that are conducted in the 60s and 70s asking respondents to consider a series of hypothetical neighborhoods. Which one would you like to move into? This all-white neighborhood here, this that's 10% white, this that's 50-50, white-black. And there's no real cost to selecting any one of those choices. And if it's something that you're a bit worried about, you think maybe the interviewer will judge me. If I say that I prefer an all-white neighborhood, maybe that's not how I see myself. I think I'm a bit more racially liberal than that. You might cheat a little bit, so to speak, and express a preference for a more racially integrated neighborhood than you would really select if, given your druthers. So I'd like to look at the real behavior in the world. Okay, so that's a lot of preamble. So I want to start now with the real meat of the talk for the last half an hour and go to the first agenda item, which is some facts about the black migration. So how much difference did a century make in where black Americans lived? I'm going to start with some regional patterns. Let's start in the year 1900, which is before the migration began. In 1900, over 90% of blacks lived in the South. And if we contrast this with the white population, at this time around a quarter of whites lived in this region. So this regional pattern is a legacy of slavery. Slavery was an economic system that was most viable for farming the cash crops in the rural South, most notably cotton. And in 1900, even 30 years after emancipation, the majority of blacks are still working as sharecroppers on land that had been farmed by slaves, by their own enslaved forebears just a generation before. Now, we can skip to the year 2008, which is the latest year for which data are available, and see where blacks live now. So today, it's still the case that over 50% of blacks live in the South. Again, a bit more overrepresented in the South relative to whites still. But the remainder, the other 50%, are split between the North and the West. And this is a very noticeable and direct implication of the migration. Now, the next picture I want to look at together is about central city population. Throughout this century, 12% of the American population is black. So that didn't change. But what did change is where blacks lived, and so their over or underrepresentedness in different parts of the country. In the year 1900, cities are disproportionately white, 95% white. Now, many of these whites are white ethnics that were part of these earlier waves of migration, but be that as it may, still the case that less than 5% of center city population was black at that time. And I think today we sort of take it for granted that we associate city, downtown population with African American. And that association is relatively new in our country's history. So if we go forward in time to 2008, we now have the cities that we are familiar with today. We have nearly majority minority cities, meaning that the majority of the city population is non-white. And that minority population is divided here, we can see, between black population and this other category, which includes Hispanics and Asians. Lately, most of the talk has been about this other category growing, this new wave of migration. But we've sort of, now it's no longer news that center cities have large black populations. We now take that for granted, and I want to sort of shake that up a little bit and lead us all to question, well, how did we know that that's true, and where did that come from? Now, the final picture that I want to show you about where blacks live is going to fill in the gaps between these endpoints. So I start with 1900 and then 2008, the 2 points of the century. But when did this really change? What decades are we talking about? So this picture, as far as you guys are concerned, is sort of, it just appears on the screen. Maybe you can download this data or something like that. I just want to underscore for any other census nerds that may be out there in the audience, I think I see one right here, maybe. Maybe there's just one, that it's very hard to count internal migration in the US. So there is no border control or INS that sits at the Mason-Dixon line and says, oh, you've crossed over from south to north. So how do we even get these numbers, and how do we get them as far back as 1900? These numbers are new estimates that I put together this summer with a graduate student at UCLA. And the best way to think about this really is, let's go back to 7th grade algebra. And the migration flow is the unknown, which we have to back out from some known quantities. So migration flow is the x. We need to fill in everything else. What we do know that's very helpful is at the beginning and end point of each one of these decades, how many blacks live in the South? So let's just take 1900. We know how many blacks are in the South in 1900 and how many are there in 1910. The key trick here is to think about this black population by age group. So take blacks who are 10 years old in 1900. By 1910, how old are they? They're 20. So if none of them died and if none of them moved out of the South, they all should be there. No new 10-year-olds can be born between 1900 and 1910. So why are there fewer of them in 1910? Some of them died of childhood diseases, but some of them moved north. We do know counts on mortality. Of course, increasingly accurate counts over time. So now we know how many people are there at the beginning and end. We know how many of these lost people are lost from death. So whatever's left over is migration, and that's where these numbers come from. Okay, so now that we know where they come from, we can think about what these numbers tell us about the outflows from the South. It looks like one big wave of migration. There's some outmigration in the decade of 1900, but very small, peaking in the decade of 1940s during World War II, when almost 1.5 million blacks leave in that decade alone, and then over time tapering off. The one outlier from that pattern is the decade of the 1930s, when we know that during the Depression, mobility rates in the entire United States were at their nadir. And the other thing we can see from here is that just like the white population, just like all Americans, blacks start returning to the South from 1970 onward, or 1960s onward, really. And so these are the numbers that are entering the South, conducted in the same, with the same method. And so some blacks are returning from their journey north back to the South, back to places like Houston and Dallas and Atlanta and growing North Carolina urban areas and so on. That's just part of American history in terms of the industrialization and growth of the South overall. But what's special in black history is this outflow from the South. And what we can see right off the bat from this picture is that we already have some clues that the black migration may be related to white suburbanization. How do we know that? Well, think about the show Mad Men, which is a show about a newly suburbanized family that takes place in the early 60s. This family moved out to the suburbs perhaps in the 1950s. Think about all of the media that you know, television shows and movies about the suburbs. It takes place in the 50s. Okay, so it's precisely in 40s, 50s, and 60s when the black migration is largest. Okay, that's not a smoking gun, but it's evidence that we should perhaps pursue to see whether we can go further than this in coming up with a causal relationship. Because we know other things were going on in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We know the highways were being built. We know that the war ended, GIs came home, and with the GI Bill, we're able to buy houses in the suburbs, and so on and so on. So we wouldn't want to just have one observation, which is the whole United States, and one time period, which is this middle part of the 20th century. What we'd like to do is carve the evidence up into a number of different separate cases, like 72 cities, for example, that might be good, and use a number of different time periods. 1940 separately from 50, separately from 60, and that's what I'm going to do in the second part of the talk. So let's transition to talking about how we document white flight in the data. By the end point of this process, as the black migration starts tapering off and blacks start, in fact, returning to the South, this is the experience that we have in cities already. And it's an experience that's similar to what we have today. Namely, that over 70% of blacks who live in metro areas live in the center, and only a third of whites who live in metro areas do. So that separation is already complete by 1980. And this separation is ongoing from 40 to 50 to 60, all through the period where the black migration was high. So did whites leave cities in part because of black arrivals? How do we show this? Let's use our evidence that comes from the variety of cities at our disposal. So the idea here is that each city is like a separate little laboratory. Each city is receiving an inflow of migrants who are arriving in this place to take factory jobs, to work in train stations as porters, and so on. And then each white population in these cities get to respond. So let's see what happens. I'm going to illustrate this for you as a simple scatter plot, where we're going to look at inflows of blacks on one axis of the graph and outflows of whites on the other. And I'm going to do this for just one of the decades in the study, but of course, keep in mind that if we get a little more complicated, we can put all of these decades together. So I'm going to go through this with you step by step. And let's start with the x-axis here, which is the change in the black population in a city over the decade of the 1950s. Each one of these dots here is a city, one of the cities in the study. And these numbers here range from negative 40,000 to positive 40,000. So it looks like some cities are losing black population and some are gaining. That's not exactly true, because these numbers are adjusted for two different things in the background. They're adjusted for regional differences, so cutting up the north into the Midwest and the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic and so on, and allowing each one of these places to have a slightly different experience. They're also adjusted for overall metropolitan area growth. So the booming areas of the West are just getting more migrants of every color, of every type, because they start as very small places in 1940, and then with shipbuilding and aircraft manufacture in World War II, they just grow like crazy. So those two things are adjusted, and actually none of the cities in the sample lose any blacks from 50 to 60. They all gain, but if you have a number over here on the negative side, it means that you didn't gain very many, and if you have a number here on the positive side, it means that you actually gained a lot. Now, the same thing is going on the y-axis with the change in the white population. And what I'm interested in is looking at the line that tells us what's the average relationship between black arrivals and white departures. The first thing to see is that the line is sloping down, negative. So more black arrivals into your city, more white departures from your city.
Is this city itself or metro area?
This is city itself. City itself.
68 metro areas.
So okay, good point. Yep. 68 cities, and they're adjusted for metro area level growth. But 68 cities. Good, thank you for that correction. The second thing to notice is not just the direction of the relationship, but also the size of the relationship. And if you take the slope of this line, it's something like 1 black arrival generating 2 white departures. So that's a number that we can use to think about white flight. But as Andrew was alluding to in his introduction, we don't really want to stop there. Because what we can see from this pattern is just that places that had a lot of black entrants also had a lot of white departures. But we don't know which causes which, or whether there's some third factor that caused both. So there are a number of stories that could generate a data process that looks like this. And one of them could be the process that we would call white flight, namely, some black migrants settle in downtown Detroit. White households live nearby. They get nervous. They're worried about having a black neighbor or a black kid in their child's classroom at school, and so they leave. They decamp for the suburbs. That could be one of the stories underlying the picture that we just saw. But there are other stories, and we need to think about the factors that would lead migrants to settle in Detroit in the first place in order to really think about what these other stories might be. So you arrive at the train station and you have the 3 different locations that Jacob Lawrence illustrates in the picture at the beginning of the talk: Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. Which one do you pick? Well, you're moving from rural South to the industrial North in order to take up a job opportunity. So maybe you move to the city that has the highest wages, that has the lowest unemployment rate, a city that's growing economically at a rapid clip, and those cities might be the places where the white households in the area are experiencing real income growth. The white households are getting richer, and they are attracted to the open space and the larger homes in the suburbs. So it could be that it's places where whites are leaving for the suburbs that are also attracting black arrivals. So how do we tell these two stories apart? Now, for this, I'm not going to go into details, but I will just give you a little teaser of the methods that I use. And if you're a student here, you might want to take Andrew's class, because I know he does talk about this paper, or you can find this paper on my website. So I use a standard statistical technique to predict where black migrants would have settled if their migration decisions were unrelated to the health of the economies in northern cities. Well, what else is motivating a migrant? Some migrants are just looking for the best job opportunities they can find, either to make a new life for themselves or to send money home to their family. But some are following their friends and their family members to a northern city. So think about a guy whose uncle has already moved to Detroit, already set himself up in the job at the Ford plant, and then writes home and says, hey, there are great jobs to be had in Detroit, and by the way, you can stay in my apartment while you're looking for work. So these factors, which we think of as a chain migration process, motivate my search for a set of underlying relationships that may predict where black migrants go once they decide to leave the South. The first thing I think about is why leave the South in the first place? To some extent because good jobs are to be had in the North, but to another extent because economic conditions in the South are collapsing for agricultural workers as the South mechanizes. So I use economic conditions throughout the South to think about when would a large pool of black migrants be ready to go, state by state. When is Mississippi mechanizing? When is Alabama mechanizing? Now they have a pool of migrants ready to go. Where do they go? And that's when I think about the story of the uncle who has the job at the Ford plant. So migrants from certain southern states have strong networks and family ties, in particular northern cities, due to the transportation networks that link these cities, particularly the trains, and also due to this chain migration process. So when Mississippi has a pool of migrants ready to go, it's not all of the cities in the north that will be affected by this, but it will be particularly Chicago relative to Detroit. When Alabama has a pool of migrants ready to go, again, it won't be all cities affected by this. It will be particularly Detroit relative to Chicago. So overall, we expect these northern cities to receive black immigrants when the typical southern sending state undergoes economic change. These are factors that I argue are unrelated to economic health in the northern cities. They are processes that are ongoing because of mechanization in southern agriculture, because of family ties, and they, in some sense, deposit migrants into a city. They just helicopter some migrants and drop them in rather than really the city itself being a magnet for migrants. Okay, so I go through this, somewhat complicated exercise that takes 3 or 4 minutes to explain, and in the end of the day, I don't find that much of this pattern that we looked at together is due to the location decisions of the black migrants. I don't find that when I predict black in-migration using this method, that really changes the relationship here relative to when I use the actual changes in the black population. So I could have shown you another picture which instead graphed the predicted black population change and looked at white response to predicted inflows, and the results would look very similar. So from this, I infer that the relationship we see here is really being driven by white location decisions, white responses, rather than by where black migrants prefer to live. So, in some ways I was surprised by this fact because, well, in some ways I wasn't surprised by this fact because we've heard about this concept of white flight. It has a ring to it because it rhymes. So, we have a sense that it might be true. And certainly when we look at cities, we see large black populations in the center and lots of whites in the suburbs. So we think there may be some causal relationship there, even if we're really just acting on instinct and inference from what we observe around us. So in that way, I wasn't surprised. But in another way, I was, because I just didn't understand why white households would be so affected by black migrants, given the level of racial segregation that exists in cities by neighborhood. So it's not the case that the typical white household in Chicago would have lived anywhere near the South Side, the large black enclave. We hear a lot about those whites who did, and a lot about their efforts to defend their neighborhoods. But what about whites living on the north side, right near the city of Evanston, who really were 5-6 miles away from a black neighbor? Why did these guys move? I did some back of the envelope calculations to say, given where whites actually lived, what if none of these North Chicago whites left? What if all of what I'm finding is just coming from the whites who are living near a black neighborhood? Are there enough of these whites to really account for what I'm finding? And there aren't. So maybe 30% of what I'm finding or so could be explained by whites who are really in direct contact or threat of direct contact with blacks. But what about everybody else? And that motivated my interest in thinking more about local government in American metropolitan areas. So even by 1970, after this enormous black inflow, over 4 million migrants finding someplace to live, it's still the case that 2/3 of white city residents lived in a neighborhood with, let's just say, no black residents. The census calls a neighborhood a place that has around 4,000 households, so maybe this neighborhood of 4,000 had one black family. 2/3 of whites in cities in 1970 lived in this kind of white enclave. So what was going on with these guys? Maybe they were attracted by the political autonomy of the suburbs from the central city, was my thought. Maybe they were concerned about how black arrivals could affect the school system, the police force, the distribution of spending across the various components of city services, the direction of where that funding would go. Would the police be attracted? Would you need to beef up the police force in the black neighborhood and then take away from the white neighborhood? And who would pay for all of this? Would property tax rates increase? By moving to the suburbs, you could avoid some of these concerns, and you could find a suburban neighborhood that closely replicated the racial composition of the neighborhood that you lived in the city. This whole line of reasoning, though, made me pull away from race on its own and think about race and class. Because these black migrants are not just black, but they're also poor, they're also southern, they're also rural, and so all of these factors may be the factors that lead existing residents to have a different set of preferences over city government and city services than the new arrivals. So what I'll show you will actually lead in that direction, that what's going on in this particular channel, this particular reason for moving to the suburbs, seems to be motivated by the fact that these migrants are poor, not just the fact that they're black. Now, that might not be true when it comes to the local interactions and the neighborhood concerns, but it seems to be true at this civic level. Okay. So in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about my research strategy for getting at this question. And in this case, I turn from looking at location decisions. So is a household located in the city versus the suburbs, and have they moved between them, to thinking about housing prices. And I do this for two reasons. First, housing prices provide useful information about location-specific goods that are traded implicitly through the housing market, which is a mouthful to say. But what that means is that there are some goods that we just can't buy as its own, on its own piece, the way we would buy an iPod, but instead it has to come bundled with a house. So for example, what if you like ocean views? You can't just buy some ocean view time every day. No, you have to buy a house that is on the beach. And it's the same with a lot of these local services. Maybe increasingly you can buy private schooling, you can buy your own security system for the house, but in a lot of, in this time period, the type of schooling that your kids had access to and the type of policing that you could call upon was a bundle with your housing location. And so by thinking about where housing prices are high and where they're low, we can learn about how much the typical homeowner was willing to pay, how much extra would they pay for the same house if it came with more of these services. The second reason why I look at housing prices is that it allows me to get very, very specific about the location-specific good that I have in mind. So what I really want to do here is separate attitudes and preferences towards the racial composition of your immediate neighbors from the racial composition of your town as a whole. But towns that are all white are filled with neighborhoods that are all white, so how do you separate the two? And the method I'm going to use is to focus in on houses that are on opposite sides of the city-suburban border. And in that case, we wouldn't expect people to be moving from one side of the border to the next, but we think that there are houses on one side or the other that could be quite similar to each other. The houses themselves were built at the same time. The neighborhood is, in fact, your neighbors may be across the street in a different town, but by virtue of being in one town versus the other, or in the city versus the suburb, these houses would have access to different services. So you simply can't send your kid to the public school across the street because you are not in that district. You simply can't call up the local police across the street because you are not in their jurisdiction. So I think we can all just introspect about the plausibility of this kind of approach. I mean, what I really rely on here is that the houses are identical. They're just carbon copies of each other, but what's different is the services. And then we can watch what happens as the city receives in-migrants from the south and see how the housing price gap changes. But we can think about a lot of these borders, I think, that we've actually driven across in our own life, and we can see, does it seem reasonable that the houses are the same? And I think some of the borders are better than others at this exercise. I live on the border between Los Angeles and Beverly Hills. I live on the Los Angeles side because I was doing this research and I said, I don't have kids in school, so I'm going to move to the LA side where the houses are cheaper because I don't have to pay for Beverly Hills schools. But the houses, as I was looking around, were built, in fact, in some cases by the same architect in the 1920s. They have the same Spanish-style design with the red roofs, but they just are separated by these public services. In fact, the real estate agents refer to my neighborhood as Beverly Hills adjacent, so that you can get some of the status that comes along with being in Beverly Hills without actually being in Beverly Hills. And by the way, there's a little slice called Beverly Hills Post Office, where in addition to all of being adjacent, you also get the 90210 zip code. So you can send your Christmas cards and you can feel cool about yourself, and people pay for that too. So some of the borders that you've experienced in your life will be quite different, actually. The houses may look quite different across the border. But again, I'm relying on the fact that I'm a quantitative historian. I'm going to look at a lot of these borders, and some won't be as good as others. Here's an illustration of the data process that I go through to get this information about housing prices. This is one of the borders in the data set out of around 100. The border between Evanston and Chicago, just a portion of that. And you can see this neighborhood in Evanston has a little triangle that fits in right up here above the Chicago neighborhoods. And then with a number of undergraduate research assistants, I use the very sophisticated highlighter method to, to highlight these blocks that are adjacent to the border. So my data set is going to consist of not the whole neighborhood here, but just the very, very edge. And then I ask, are housing prices higher on the suburban side? Yes. In my data set by around 5%, 1970. And then what are the factors that determine whether this gap between city and suburban housing prices is large or small? So when I say on average the gap is 5%, that it's not 5% everywhere. It's larger in some types of cities and smaller in other types of cities. And what I'm interested in is it larger in cities where there's a large black population or a growing black population due to migration? Is it larger in places with a large poor population? And what about if we do like a horse race and say, is it really the poverty issue or is it the race issue? And it turns out to be the poverty issue. And I'm just going to illustrate the relationship here that I see in my data, and then I will just conclude. So this is the last substantive slide. Though it's kind of a doozy of a last slide. There's a lot going on. So I'm just going to take a quick minute. On the x-axis is the gap in the poverty rate between the whole city and the whole suburbs. So there are some suburbs that look very similar to the city, and the gap is only like a 1 percentage point. And there's some that are really quite different. So Detroit and its rich suburb, Grosse Pointe, there's a 10 percentage point gap in poverty rates in 1970. So I think Grosse Pointe is the subject of a movie, Grosse Pointe Blank, like John Cusack, so with all these really big mansions and stuff. So that's sort of one of the biggest gaps in the data. Now, on the y-axis is the percentage gap in housing prices between the suburb and the city, where these positive numbers mean that the suburban housing that are just on the edge of the suburban city are more expensive. And
Just a quick question.
yeah.
Can you show us the date of this? Or?
Oh, sorry, 1970. I apologize. You guys are such good slide readers and catching all my mistakes. So in 1970, if you are on the suburban side of a poor city, the gap in your housing values are much higher than if you're on the suburban side.
Meaning 20% or 0.2%?
This is 20%.
Okay, so it's 0.2, it's not percent, then it's
Yeah.
proportion.
Correct. These are actually, yeah, they're log
We're fussy about our numbers, too.
they're log differences. So yeah, thank you. Right. So if you're in one of these very extreme situations, like Detroit and Grosse Pointe, just crossing the border makes the housing value increase by 20%. If you're in one of these less extreme situations, the gap is not as severe in housing prices. So we can also look at this over time as the city becomes poorer and this relationship holds. And we can also look at whether this relationship holds as the city becomes blacker. And it does, but once we do the horse race between poverty and race, it's poverty that seems to be relevant here. So from this I conclude that households are drawn to the suburbs to separate themselves fiscally from problems in the center city. Because here, this sample, just to remind all of you, is at the border itself, where the neighborhood really is the same as you cross the border. You hang out with people across the border. They're just a block away. And so the quality of the housing and the character of the neighborhood is quite similar, but what's different here is, are you responsible for paying city taxes? And do you have to receive city services provided in the proportion that the city and all of its voters choose to allocate? So to summarize then, I'm going to return to my 3 goals of the talk and just restate them as 3 conclusions. My first goal was to give you some facts about the black migration. And what I've argued is that from 1900 to 1970, 5 million blacks left the rural South. This outflow peaked in the 1940s, and the majority of these migrants settled not just in metro areas, but in center city metro areas. Then the second goal was to document that there was some white response to this inflow. And I've shown you that for every black arrival, there was 2 or more white departures from the center. And then I asked, why leave the center if you're living in a white enclave anyways? And for this, I say that white flight is motivated not only by local interactions with black neighbors or fear of a black neighbor arriving, but also by the lure of political autonomy in the suburbs from an increasingly diverse and both racially and socioeconomically center city. So I want to put in a plug for a broader project of which this talk was a part. I'm working on a book right now for Princeton University Press that I think will have the title that I gave to the talk itself, Competition in the Promised Land. And the argument that I make is that indeed the migration had some benefit in terms of numbers of blacks in the center city, but also had some costs. So on the benefit side, migrants serve as voters for black politicians, increase black political efficacy, customers for black-owned businesses, and parishioners for black churches. But what historians have left out when they think about these benefits is to think also of the costs of numbers, that migrants encouraged white departures from center cities en masse, expanding segregation, and segregation importantly across jurisdiction lines in the North and West, and also created competition for jobs typically filled by black workers. And I think that this way of thinking about mass migration in general as a population movement that has both benefits and costs for the community to which the migrant belongs is something that extends beyond just the black migration to other waves of mass migration. So just as I think about this for the mid part of the 20th century, I think for Hispanic migrants today, the same argument could be made that migrants do serve as, for example, voters that expand Hispanic efficacy, but create competition for jobs typically held by other Latin American entrants. So this does help us think about the fact that in economics literature, people haven't found much of a competitive effect between Hispanic arrivals and native-born workers, but it seems like a lot of the competition is concentrated among the migrants themselves, really a generational conflict between new arrivals and somewhat long-standing arrivals. So I want to stop there and thank you all for your attention and open for questions. Yes.
I think I have two questions. One, it has to do with your argument that large numbers of whites in cities didn't live anywhere. They lived in all white neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. They didn't live adjacent to black neighborhoods, and therefore, what were they afraid of? Mm-hmm. I have to say, I don't find that line of reasoning very persuasive unless Detroit and Chicago, say, are exceptional cities. And you can make that argument, perhaps. But it does seem to me that in a city like Detroit and a city like Chicago, and I think there are other case studies as well, but certainly in those two cities, there was so much volatility around black in-migration, and especially around housing issues and blockbusting and so on, that you get in the work of Tom Shagru and in the work of Arnold Hirsch, you get quite extraordinary portraits of cities in real turmoil and over a fairly sustained period of time. And it does seem to me that the fact that you may live several neighborhoods out, so to speak, doesn't make you kind of, oh, well, I'm not going to worry about that because, after all, they're really not in my neighborhood yet. Mm-hmm. I mean, it does seem to me that would create a climate that would create fear across the substantial segments of the white population. Secondly, I'm really stunned by the fact that unless I fell asleep momentarily and didn't hear you, you didn't talk about the whole question of where jobs were going, because there is a tremendous outmigration of jobs from central city areas in this time into suburbs. And again, Detroit is a wonderful example of that. Shagru statistics actually show a significant decline in manufacturing jobs in Detroit in the 1950s, but a significant expansion of job opportunities, often in the automobile industry, in suburbs and increasingly distant suburbs and so on. And so whites are going to follow the jobs to those suburbs, and they're going to move to those suburbs, but blacks can't do that. They can't do that because of housing discrimination, and they may be able to follow the jobs, although it's much harder for them, and I think that's been demonstrated in many cases. So those are two kind of big issues that struck me in your talk. I won't go on and give a mini lecture, but I'd like to see what you have to say.
Those are excellent questions. And let me just take them one by one. I think that on your first point of that in some sense, the statistics I bring forward that 2/3 of whites live in a neighborhood with, at the point in time, no black neighbors is in some ways misleading. And I'm glad that you brought that up because those statistics are at a point in time, and they don't take into account the dynamics of how the neighborhoods change as the small black enclave becomes a larger and larger black ghetto. So as you were talking, I was thinking of ways of incorporating that into what I do, and I think one thing that could be really interesting is to say, we now have the experience of hindsight in history. We know how large the black ghettos eventually became. What if we take the white population living in the borders of the largest extent that black enclaves become by 1980 or something like that, and say anyone in that circle could have a reasonable fear that they may encounter a black neighbor and some serious neighborhood change and turnover over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, and they may move out preemptively. And if I do that, for sure the number that I put forward is going to change, and it will lessen the puzzle, so to speak, about why white households were moving out to the suburbs. But I do want to underscore that I think there's two different channels for why people moved. One of them is this direct neighborhood local interactions concern, and like you're saying, the numbers I gave you may be too conservative on that channel. But the other channel of concerns that would apply even if you were nowhere near the black enclave and never thought that in 100 years the border of the black enclave would get to your area, you may leave as well. And I think that's something that my work does bring to light. Now, the second question was about jobs moving out to the suburbs and whether that was one of the forces that led whites to leave. And out of all the forces was perhaps one that would also create a white-black division because blacks couldn't follow for a number of housing discrimination reasons and so on. I think that that's definitely part of the story, and I hope that I didn't leave you with the impression that my research concludes that white flight is the reason why whites left for the suburbs. In fact, if you take the numbers that I put forward and you think about how large was the overall move out to the suburbs and how much of that overall move can we explain, it's around 20%. Now, if you tell the 20% number to a historian or a sociologist, they say, wow, that sounds really small. Because I thought that the suburbs were essentially the creation of white flight and fears about changes in the center city. If you tell it to an economist, they say, oh, that seems ridiculously big. I thought it was all real income growth, and housing is a normal good. It's a good that you want more of if you have more income. So you move out to the suburbs where you can buy these big houses. And prices, so it's income and prices to the economist, prices being the price of commuting. Because as roads are built, as the car diffuses, it's cheaper to commute back into the center. So if you're telling me it has something to do with race, that really changes what my attitudes, because I thought it was income and prices. So I don't know if we all think that number is big or small, but that's what it is. And so that leaves a lot of additional explanatory power for factors like jobs moving out to the suburbs. And because I'm all about plugs and self-promotion today, I actually have a paper about the role of job relocation to the suburbs and how important that was. And it's a factor, but again, not the whole story. So the way I see it, what we're in the business of is piecemeal, looking at each one of these possible factors one by one, and then through that we tell the whole story.
I'm Bill Fischel. I'm an economist. Nelson's the historian here. The question I want to ask is actually about the micro comparison on the side of the streets. Did you always select cities, or did you select school districts, or was there a mixture of the two? And the reason I'm asking, before I get your answer, is that if it's school districts, actually, if it's school districts or it's cities, there's an interesting event study possible, and maybe you've thought about this, of desegregation and busing orders in cities, which did not all happen simultaneously. And so you get some differential where you might be able to find that Detroit, which had a busing order relatively early on, was found to discriminate, versus Los Angeles was almost a decade later, and they resisted this with various initiatives. That you might be able to identify some of the effect of, was it the schools or was it the other municipal services that were going on here?
My answer to that question is come to my talk tomorrow in the economics department, because I was thinking very much along the same lines as you, and thought, well, if I push this a little further in time from 70 to 80, a lot of the districts in my sample that are in the north and west did experience school desegregation. And school desegregation in the north happens a bit later than in the south. It waits for a key Supreme Court decision that says, look, even if you didn't segregate your schools by law, you're still on the hook to remedy segregation that emerges through residential patterns. And so from 70 to 80, a number of the cities that I look at do experience court-ordered desegregation, and I try to price that out with housing prices. But a number of them don't. And so what's interesting is that it's really hard to say from the beginning which of these cities are going to experience a court order and which won't on the basis of their poverty characteristics. And to some extent, certainly the more blacks you have, the more likely you are, the more at risk you are of being desegregated. But that's the big thing. The only thing I don't do, which was part of your comment and which would be amazing to do, but the data just don't exist as far as I know, is to really be able to use the timing of when these court orders come around. Because you're absolutely right, some are in the early 70s, some are in the late 70s and after. But I'm using census of housing data, which is at the 2 census points. So otherwise, I say, stay tuned.
Have you ever looked at crime rates and violence as a factor in that? For example, as I'm looking at your slide and creating competition for jobs, the reality in places like the west side of Chicago in those times is that there weren't jobs for various reasons. But a result of that, in many cases, were large numbers of young people living in the streets and not going to school and joining street gangs, which became a very predominant force across a wide area. And certainly contributed to decisions by whites to, I don't care if it's working.
I'll repeat the question, don't worry. So the question was, when thinking about the consequences of the black migration, if the migrants did really compete with existing black workers for jobs, could it be a contributing factor to growth in crime rates, gang activity in black neighborhoods? And I was inspired by that possibility in terms of pursuing this work. I haven't pursued it yet, though, and in theory I could. So what I mean by that is I got into this topic by reading William Julius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged, and he's trying to understand why are center city neighborhoods so concentrated in poverty and concentrated in some social ills like high crime and idleness, so a large number of young people not working. And he has sort of a throwaway set of paragraphs at the beginning saying, well, we have to keep in mind that these changes in center cities happen starting in the 60s. And at this point, the black population is really a first-generation migrant population. Most of the working population had just arrived from the South 10 or 20 years before, and then the kids are all the children of these migrants. And so maybe we're being a bit too hard on these neighborhoods because there's a process of in-migration and assimilation, and if we compare and think about the types of neighborhoods that were in place in cities in the early 20th century with this earlier wave of migration, maybe a lot of the same social ills held. And then he goes on to sort of reject that and say, see, you know, the problems in cities today are actually somewhat worse, or maybe much worse, than early 20th century cities. And blacks are not just migrants, but they have specific challenges that they face, and so let's look at that. But he leaves the migration issue on the table as a possible contributing factor. And again, like my answer before, that it might be part of the story, but not everything, I decided to look into that. And I do find that black earnings growth would have been faster in the North if not for facing the competition from this inflow. And so there was some amount of convergence between white income and black income in the North, and it would have been around 50% more convergence between whites and blacks if not for the migration. So that's sizable, and it could also contribute sort of down the line to these other sorts of social ills, and I just haven't followed that thread.
Just a question for you about some of the last things you spoke about, including the last slide. In the early part of the talk, when you were talking about racial differences, it was all in terms of a disamenity. There's a fiscal cost, and what you discussed later with the poverty gap was that there's a fiscal cost,
Yes.
but there's also a disamenity. And I wonder if you've thought about the way you're going to separate out the pure fiscal cost of having a poverty gap from the disamenity aspects, which I would think of as a residual.
Mm-hmm.
What are the disamenities?
Well, I mean, now there's a check cashing place on the corner to provide services to lower income populations, in addition to how much you have to pay in order to sort of redistribute resources, through city channels.
And when you say disamenities, are you also thinking about just pure racism and aversion to being near a black pocket or
No,
a
it's not-
black
it's
neighborhood,
not.
or do you mean these other sort of private retail businesses and so on that?
I
that
don't
may-
take a position on that part of it.
Right.
There's a part which is a transfer of city services
Yep.
that you could look to price through data on the local governments. And then there's a residual,
And then there's
which
everything
is
else, right.
everything else.
Right. Well, I don't have much more to add to the question than just that I'll take it as a comment, because I think that that's a good way of kind of wrapping these two things together and saying, can we get a breakdown at the end of the day of how much of what we see is coming through this fiscal channel and how much is everything else, so to speak. And I haven't really done that or thought about it that way, but I think that's reasonable to, and it's a good way to have a final punchline. So if there's anything else, I'm happy to entertain other questions. I don't see other hands, so I'm also happy to release everyone for dinner. So I know that Dartmouth dinner starts at 5:30, I hear, so people may be hungry.